Well, the last time we were here, except here was somewhere else, actually it was in a gazebo, wasn't it? Somewhere east of here, when I discussed and presented some of the work of Ralph Gustafson. I've forgotten, that sentence was so long that I've forgotten how I was going to conclude it. Anyway, the last time we were here, we did discuss Ralph Gustafson, and I did, and present to you some of his poems. And I'd like to take a look at D.G. Jones. D.G. Jones was his literary name, and of course I knew him as Doug. And we're in North Hatley, by the way, and you can't see the lake from here, but Ralph Gustafson also lived in North Hatley. In fact, a number of writers lived in North Hatley. In fact, what you're looking at right now is D.G. Jones' writing cabin in the back of his property, and you can't see it because you're facing me. Behind us, to my left, is another property, a very, very cozy looking cabin on a hillside where the famous novel Two Solitudes by Hugh MacLennan was written. Anyway, they knew each other, needless to say. I'll give you some. D.G. Jones has been identified and as certainly one of the most important Canadian lyric poets of the latter part of the 20th century. And I'll give you a little bit of a bio. He's from Bancroft, Ontario, which is, as I recollect, firmly on the Canadian Shield, and appropriately, since he was living on the Canadian Shield and raised on the Canadian Shield, his dad was a lumberman, a very successful lumberman. And Jones went to a school, presumably went to primary school there, and he went from there to I think it was called Grove Preparatory College, which I believe is an affiliate of the Lakefield School near Peterborough, which I also believe, I can be corrected, I think one of the royal princes attended, believe it or not. This was after D.G. And then D.G. then went from there to McGill, and where I think he got his BA, and then I think he went to Queen's University, where he got a PhD on Pound and Ezra Pound. I should point out, this is kind of an interesting detail, you know. When he was at McGill, D.G. Jones was in a nighttime course taught by Louis Dudek, who I think I did 2 sessions ago, who was teaching a course on Ezra Pound. And the interesting thing here is that the 3 people I have dealt with so far, Louis Dudek, Ralph Gustafson, and D.G. Jones, were all students of Ezra Pound. and this is sort of significant, and I've been warned not to get too academic here, but I'm going to sort of like, you know, wander around the fringes of academic discourse, right? If you look at modernism, or what they call high modernism, which is early modernism, which was the sensibility that replaced Romanticism, late Victorianism and Romanticism, they tend to say that T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, right, and Ezra Pound, the cantos, were the sort of the two key deities of early modernism in the English language. And one branch went off Pound, and what, you know, from then on, different schools, you know, exfoliations within the aesthetics of poetry. One went off on Pound, and one went off on Eliot. And the interesting thing here is that all of the three poets I've discussed either taught or did courses with or on, or wrote essays or books on Ezra Pound, right? So that's sort of, I'm fascinated by that. There's a book in that one, but I'm not going to write it, okay? And while I'm at it, it might be interesting, since I'm going to talk about D.G. Jones, to give you some sort of sense, right, of D.G. Jones's work, okay, a general sense. And I'll give that in the context of Eliot, in the context of Pound, and in the context of Dudek, right, and in the context of Gustafson, and in the context of Doug Jones himself. Now, if you've seen the previous film of me doing a delivery on Dudek, Dudek's style is extremely plain, prosy. You might call it plain song. He sort of rejected the floweriness of the Victorian period and the traditional conventions of the Victorian period, and any contemporary poetry schools during his own time which in any way appeared to be influenced by those, right? Then you have Gustafson, right? Now, I think Dudek sort of was a little bit sort of, how should we put it? He looked a bit askance at Gustafson's, because Gustafson, especially his early poetry, was very, very, I won't call it flowery, highly rhetorical. And this made sense, because remember, Gustafson went to Oxford, right? And he came under the influence of a number of the kind of, I guess, the Georgians and the late Victorian poets. And so he was influenced by their rhetoric, right? The sort of, not precisely romantic 19th century rhetoric, but let's put it, he'll use a $10 word if it came to that, right? And used a lot of them. And Dudek wasn't so crazy about that. Though, interestingly enough, and I'll make another comment about this comment, nevertheless, what did Gustafson, who you would think was not influenced by Pound because of his high rhetoric, what did he teach at Bishop's? He taught a course in Pound, right, which is rather paradoxical, right? Okay. Then you've got Jones, right? Now Jones's style is neither like kind of the plain song of Dudek, nor, if you want to call it, the sort of more rhetorical efflorescences of Gustafson's. Jones is sort of a kind of wry, sort of clipped, sort of witty tone, right? You know, Jones himself, Doug himself, they were all very erudite, by the way, like overwhelmingly erudite, and it was frightening to be with them for that reason. But Jones also was very sort of sidelong erudite, right? He was very wry, you know, and it's very different from the high rhetoric of Gustafson, and also very different from sort of kind of lean, plain song of Dudek, right? So, and they all knew each other, by the way, and they were all quite famous. So they all won Governor General's awards, right? And on several occasions I found myself, you know, the shaky little novitiate, you know, sort of sitting with them, sipping his beer, right? And as they sort of, there's a lot of bonhomie between them, but you could see also there was a certain aesthetic frisson, you know, between them too. Okay, back to Jones, okay. Now, one other comment I should make, but I think it's relevant. When the critics deal with these people, the Canadian critics, they always remark how they evolved in their poetry, right? Because one thing about Canadians, and I'm one myself, is they sort of feel that the 19th century, right, Canada was essentially a colonialist mentality, and in terms of everything, including its art, the big movement of the 20th century was to build your own home and live in it instead of living in other people's houses, i.e. the American aesthetics and the Canadian, the British aesthetics. The same thing that Emerson was talking about in his essays about the United States, right, in the 1840s and 1850s. So there has been in Canadian poetry in the 20th century a struggle to write something that is genuinely Canadian. Right, okay. And what is genuinely Canadian in Canada? Genuinely Canadian has generally been, apart from imitating American and Canadian modes of expression, right, is accepting where the hell we are, you know. In other words, don't write about Canada with what in effect are British settings, right, okay, or American settings. Have you noticed, for example, for those of you who know something about Canadian painting, you look at 19th century Canadian painting and the settings and the paintings are European, they're not Canadian, right? And that's true in terms of the literature too, to a large degree. So they were all three of them in their growth process, which I talked about, right, were struggling or are appreciated or not or unappreciated by critics for their ability essentially to write about Canadian things in a Canadian context against a Canadian setting, right? Instead of a European one. And Jones basically went to this evolution too. His early poems, right, though not to the degree that Gustafson's early poems were, his early poems were sort of, they were subservient, if that's the right word, to traditional 19th century poetic conventions. They didn't rhyme, but they did half rhyme. But there was, at least in the very early ones in his first books, there was a kind of a metrical sensibility there. I mean, it wasn't iambic pentameter, but there was certainly an ear for meter, and certainly an ear for the number of syllables and a tendency to break things down into stanzas, right, into punctuation everywhere, right? So, of course, he was far ahead of Gustafson, who was writing in meter and with rhyme, etc., right? So that's early Jones. And then he evolved, he dropped the meter, he dropped the syllabic stuff, right? And basically he moved towards free verse, vers libre, right, which has no rhymes, okay. The meter is incidental. The syllables basically try to emphasize or try to underscore the emphasis of natural emotion and speech within the lines. His imagery, more and more as he grew older, was away from, say, mythological reference, obscure mythological reference, right? And was more dealing with Canadian subjects, and more wrote about what was under his nose, right? You know, i.e. sort of, he wasn't writing about the eagles on the Eries, right? And he wasn't writing about sort of, you know, personifying love, you know, he was writing about the chips in his dishware or something like that, right? And making metaphors of that. That is the movement of contemporary poetry, right? Okay, so let me point out, I have some poems here, and I'll point out something about, I picked up a couple of his most famous poems, and then I picked a couple of poems that I really like, because I think I like a lot of Jones. There are a couple of poems or a couple of techniques or aspects I have a little difficulty with, but that may be because of my own cognitive issues. I have no idea. Anyway, this is the portrait of Anne Hébert, right, who is a very famous French-Canadian writer, Quebecois writer. And you get a sort of sense of Jones here. It's an early poem, but you get a sense of the late middle period Jones, and at the same time, perhaps you get a sense, a little bit of what might be perceived as his obscurity. Okay. Portrait of Anne Hébert. The sunlight here and there touches a table, and a draft at the window announces your presence. Anne Hébert's. You take your place in the room without a fuss. Your delicate bones, your frock, have the grace of disinterested passion. Words are arrayed like surgical instruments, neatly in trays. Deftly you make an incision, probing the obscure disease. Your sensibility has the sure fingers of the blind. Each decision cuts like a scalpel through tangled emotion. You define the morbid tissue, laying it bare, like a tatter of lace dark on the paper. Okay, it's a striking poem. You'll notice that I'll start with you notice the diction. By the way, he's really writing about himself. You notice that? I was going to say, notice how precise and incisive the diction is and how clipped the music of it is and how sort of succinctly and definitively assertive his statements are. Words are, this is from his poem, he's talking about himself, right? Words are arrayed like surgical instruments neatly in trays. Deftly you make an incision probing the obscure disease. It's sort of, his language there embodies his technique there. And that's the way he is, okay? And you'll see it again and again and again. You'll also notice the music of it. You notice there's a lot of what is technically called, it's alliteration and assonance. Alliteration is the strategic repetition of consonants, right? And assonance is the strategic, repetition of vowels, right? So, when you listen to him, you get a lot of consonants and assonance. In fact, you get a lot of susurrants, right? And when I say that, as he moved away from conventional techniques, and I hope I'm not getting too academic here because my wife is fidgeting a bit, okay? He's moving towards these sort of things, right? Assonance and consonants and half rhymes, right? Natural speech and clipped speech. None of this is sort of language, that you sort of, you would expect to see in 19th century high rhetoric Victorian poetry, okay? The other thing I want to point out about him, notice that example, your delicate bones describing her, right? The writer, your frock have the grace of disinterested passion. It's a wonderful phrase. This is me talking. I will probably get lynched for this. It's a wonderful phrase, but what does it mean? What is disinterested passion? See, I think he sort of, my view, he moves towards a kind of an abstraction, you see. And he does. It's a very elegant abstraction, because the language is very elegant. And I believe, by the way, it's essentially kind of French. That is to say, it's articulated in terms of the language which has the origins in the French language, whereas Gustafsson, who's highly Victorian at times and rhetorical, articulates in the language of the Latin, right, you see. So the thing is that the French language in English is very graceful. It's very elegant, right? Where the Latin language is sort of kind of juridical and sort of thumpy, right? It's impressive. And I think that one of the things you see in Jones is obscurity at times, you see. And I think to some degree he very successfully masks it, in my view, in very elegant language. He's very seductive. Right. And that's, I think, important. And we're going to see more of that. And of course, there's a counter-argument to that. Okay. So I point that out. I also point out one other thing, okay, which you can either be critical of or you can appreciate. And that he jumps between images. Have you noticed that? Like he goes from, delicate bones, physical side, and then you shift to the conceit, the extended metaphor of surgery, right? Okay. And then he moves at the end of that to the notion, the final stanza, like a tatter of lace dark on the paper, which is a kind of image completely different from surgical imagery, right? So he could be criticized for that. In fact, there was one critic, right, Stan Dragland, I believe, who said that what he did that Jones did is he skidded between verbal units, right, quote unquote. Or you can see that as part of postmodernism, right? Now, modernism essentially argues that your imagery should all be connected, right? There's a unity that is derived from earlier Victorian and pre-Victorian poetry, and then there is this new sort of vision that the world ain't like that, right? Because we're bombarded all the time by media and bits of knowledge, and our life and world is extremely fragmented, which of course it always was, but it's even more so. And so art should to some degree be a bricolage, right? It should express the fragmentation and incoherence of the world. Now I have a funny feeling one's own emotional inclination has something to do with whether you like this or not. But you can sort of see that here, and you'll see even further. And likewise, obscurity, right, along with this fragmentation, obscurity can either be seen as he didn't sit down and walk it out and comb it out properly, right? Or it can be seen as, Steve, the world is obscure, time to wake up, baby, So you can see it as a device, you see. And I think the critics who approve, and a lot of critics really do approve of Jones, he won 2 Governor General's awards, one for his book, Under the Thunder, the Flowers Light Up the Earth, and the other for a book of translation. Most of the critics that really appreciate Jones see these as effective techniques. Okay. Now, the thing about, I was talking about Canada, and I was talking about, to some degree, Canadian, writing in your own home in Canada meant looking at what was actually here, right? And as you know, overwhelmingly, what is actually here in Canada, or maybe it isn't, this is another thing I can raise, is the natural world, right? And it ain't ultimately a particularly, how should we call it, cozy natural world, is it, And in fact, Jones, what you see in Jones, in poem after poem after poem in his 10 books, is stuff about the snow. Right, and the snow falling or the snow melting and the mud of the thaw, and dead gardens and stuff like that, right? There's lots of that, right? And about this garden right here where you're sitting, he built that out of stones. He built that platform there. He built all the rockeries along here. So many of these poems are actually about right here. Okay. Nature. Canadian poets embrace nature, right? And this is an example of one of his poems. The stream, because he's being metaphorical here, obviously. The stream exposed with all its stones. The stream exposed with all its stones flung on the raw field is covered once again with snow. It is not hidden, it flows. The houses in the valley standing motionless below seem wrapped in sunlight like snow and are deceptive. Even the stones deceive us. The Creator goes rampaging through our lives. Winter is a masquerade. I tell you, nakedness is a disguise. The white is dark below. The silence is the water's cry. I tell you, in those silent houses, girls are dancing like the stones. So he's sort of saying the world may be frozen up, right? And it may look like there's nothing there and it's blank, right? But underneath there's something, life lives. So it's interesting that he describes it as dark, this, which is sort of interesting. So, and he writes about winter, not only nature, but winter a lot. There's no doubt about it, and especially the snow. And, okay, so other things he writes. So, gardens he writes a lot about. And it's interesting because you could argue, couldn't you? I mean, this is me again being a bit of a kind of a contrarian, right? You could say that Gustafson, right, and you can say that Jones and Dudek kind of embrace Canadian nature, but actually if you look at it closely, they write about their garden. They don't actually write much about the wilderness. So in some ways I found it very interesting, and I was talking to a doctoral student from England who was talking to me about this. She was talking about the role of Canadian nature in Canadian literature, and yes, it was very true that in the 20th century Canadian poets embraced their actual environment, but this was made out to seem, and of course it was in some cases true, that this was an embracing of the wilderness, right? There is one poet around it, Frank Scott, who did write about Lake Massawippi, right, which he basically described as if it was wild, which it isn't. And so they were basically embracing the Canadian wilderness, but actually that's not true, you see. They actually were writing poems about nature, about the garden, you see. So the old critique of the Canadian sensibility that we're sort of kind of, basically this is a place where we're not so much concerned with a revolution as we are with insulation, because we have to stay warm, right? Okay. The notion that the wilderness is seen as other and hostile, kind of, you could argue, still exists among poets who putatively have embraced Canadian nature, but actually are writing about their garden, right? I don't know. That could get me lynched. But it's an interesting observation, I think. Okay. Okay, so, but he was very much into gardens. Now, here's one about gardens, okay? About gardens and oncoming winter. The cut back beds. Right? We're talking about those beds right down there, which no doubt he cuts back. When you cut back beds in the fall primarily, don't you? Okay. Delight in the amputation of plants, stumps of flowers, makes this season bearable. There are forms of truth. Show me your scars, the disposition of your roots, the base plot mapped by moles, indexed above ground by these pale fans, these brown straws, these limp members. In rain or in the odd balmy light of October, their beauty has no ratings. There are forms of truth. The virulent stubble of gardens exposed to the elements, raw evidence of the surgeon's ruthless desire. So he appreciates cut-back gardens, you see. And but you can also see, in a sense, the sense of mutability, the recognition of the inexorable cycles and deaths of natural environments, and what he refers to in one poem not as the efficiency of time. It's full a lot of that, and as he grows older, it becomes even more acute, But he tries to appreciate it, as you can see here, as well as to some degree sort of kind of shut up and grow tense at the prospect of it. Okay, now what is one of our common strategies in dealing with the ephemerality of life, of the body, of the world, right? Well, Angela, what is one of the Western poetic strategies of dealing with ephemerality, mutability, the brevity of life and the world, and the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Zen. That's right. In other words, the Latins called it lacrimae rerum, the tears of things, right? And the Japanese term is I've forgotten what it is for the passage of the sadness or the bittersweetness of the passage of things. I've forgotten the Japanese term. Well, he was very influenced by Chinese poetry particularly, and wrote many appreciations of Chinese poets and of a kind of, among other things, Sung Dynasty silk paintings. and wrote a number of poems about them. And in fact, as Angela well knows, he in that way, in that sense, he kind of joins a kind of almost a kind of an Eastern Townships motif, doesn't he? In fact, one of the first not very well known Canadian Eastern Townships poets, Amy Bowman, wrote, was actually an Amy gist, you know, after Amy Lowell, who essentially was one of the early imagists and was initially a companion of Ezra Pound until he rejected her because he felt she got stuck on imagery, short imagistic poems. They were both influenced, both Pound and Amy Lowell, by the translations of Chinese and Japanese poetry. Anyway, yeah, we have Bowman who wrote, and of course we have a single but rather brilliant haiku by Leonard Cohen, right? And we're going to see if we can come up with the rock on which you know it is carved. And we have Jones himself, and though it's in nowhere a quote from a Japanese haiku, it's interesting. It's a quote from. My brain is going at this particular. Who's the most famous, most rambunctious of all Canadian male poets? Irving Layton, who is, if anything, very unzen, or was anything. This is a quote from one of Irving Layton's poems, "Butterfly on Rock," right? And this was a formative book in Canadian criticism of poetry by Jones, published in 1970. And but though it's from Layton, Jones picked it, and it sort of has that kind of how should we put it, Oriental tincture, doesn't it? And just for the sake of it, Doug's wife, Monique, has given me a souvenir. I don't know who made this for Doug, but it is a butterfly, or painted butterfly on rock, right? So it's rather wonderful, I think. Okay, so you don't have Leonard Cohen's haiku on a rock, but we do have this particular butterfly on a rock. Anyway, yes. So Jones was influenced by Japanese and Chinese poetry, and I have one here for you, written as he grew older. The window. He's looking through a window and he's contemplating the experience of looking through a glass window, presumably out of doors. Glass is beautiful like the Zen mind, but the dead bird, its moss-colored wings, spotted breast, the spidery toes, an eye clouded over, to be placed on a stump like the others, is a koan hard to see through. The glass holds no birds, clouds, vacant air, leaves pretty rubbish, perhaps clearing the mind. So it's kind of a wonderful poem, the notion that, you know, as you know, the koan is ultimately insoluble, unless I guess you achieve satori, don't you? And in a sense he's saying that the dead bird is insoluble, having to deal with death and mortality and the brevity of life. And there are several other poems, I think, to Chinese masters. Wu Wei, I believe, is one that he writes a poem to in one of his earlier books. Okay, his obscurity. I find him a bit obscure. He grows more obscure at the end, right, in his last books, which were published by a friend of mine, Sonia Skarstead. But you could argue that also it was an evolution of his style. He became, I think, more and more spontaneous, you see, and associative. And I think that the natural end of kind of the rejection of, if you will, certainly Victorianism or high modernism, which stressed kind of, I guess you would call it almost sort of coate instead of inchoate, right? Inchoate development was a movement towards an attempt to imitate the operations of the mind. And of course that's where stream of consciousness came from, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf and people like that, right? So you could argue, and it is argued by some, that sort of kind of hit the happenstance, but the brilliant imagery of his final poems, that when he was in his, I guess he quit writing poetry when he was about 76, and I have a note on that too, was an accurate reflection of what he perceived to be the natural end of his particular technique. After the age of 75 or 76, what did he do? Well, his poems are full of allusions to paintings. He became a computer artist, which is fascinating. I would never have guessed it. And he spent the last 10 years of his life doing computer art, and there are some in there, you can see them. And but when you think about his fascination with art, he talks about, well, I mean, his most famous book, the one that won the Governor General's Award, Under the Thunder, The Flowers Light Up the Earth, has a painting by David Milne, the Canadian David Milne on it, who has a very distinctive elliptical style, which of course is completely appropriate for Jones, who had a very distinctive elliptical style. But he also refers to many others in here, you know. So it was quite logical, I think, for him to move to painting. And maybe what we can do afterwards is we can go in and take a look at some of them. Any questions? He was very droll. He was very droll. He was I sort of think of him as Scottish, but probably it wasn't a trait of the Scots, but he was very wry. He was very wry. You know, you always felt when you were with him and you were talking about life or something that, you know, not that he'd got your number, but that he'd got the number of the universe a step beyond how you'd got the universe, you know. And he was very charming too. You met him, didn't you, briefly? Actually, just before he died. Very charming, and very. And he as a reader, he wasn't like me, you know, waved his hands and rhetorical. You know, he was sort of kind of understated. You know, and initially you sort of thought, oh, he should project a bit more, but he was one of those people who could suck you in. You know, and which really is the most effective, I think, way of doing presentations. And he was a very nice man, and very erudite, and to some degree his obscurity may not be obscurity at all. It may be I'm just a bit too dumb to get it. You know, I think I was thinking that last night reading these things.
The chair.
The chair. Ah, the chair. As he leaned back, relieved. This is his writing chair. Nothing fancy about it. In fact, it sort of kind of looks like a 1950s, not quite a 1950s office chair, because it actually sort of swings a bit. Maybe it's a sort of 1950s your private office chair, right? And then you want me to step in and get one of his paintings? That might help, eh? This one is called Strange Diploid. I don't even know what a diploid is.
Two sides, two faces, two forms.
I guess so. And here's another one, which is rather intriguing. This is called Cervantes Learns to Fly. This one's a bit, has a theme.
Kind of that way a bit, just swivel a bit. Yes, a bit. Reflections and all that. Perfect. Cervantes Learns to Fly.
You wouldn't think somebody would turn after, a reputation. Well, I think you would actually. I've known a number of writers who kind of, they have interesting hobbies. It's a way of using another part of the brain. Well, I guess we all do that to some degree, don't we? Me, it's the harmonica. Well, there we have it. Okay, was it okay? I wasn't too...
No, very interesting.
I was sort of kind of I strayed out a long way. I was wondering whether I could bring the cat back into the corral at one point. But, I like to be a bit academic, On the other hand, of course, you can't be too academic or too stuff off the chairs,